Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us again here on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. And everyone will know when we play that music, that means that we're going to be joined by our favorite guest up in Canada, Dr. Scott Stevens, Director of Regional Operations for the Prairies and Boreal. Scott, welcome back to the podcast.
Always good to join you, Mike, and the podcast listeners. And I'm glad that you identified me as the favorite guest this time. I'm glad we've established that.
I said favorite guest from up in Canada. Let's, just kind of make sure we compartmentalize
I took that as
that.
favorite guest overall. I don't know. The listeners will have to judge what the intent was.
Okay, that's fair enough. Fair enough. So provide your feedback to us. We'll make a judgment on that. But yeah, it's great to have you back here. We're the latter part of January. By the time this episode airs, we actually may be on the last day of January or even early February. I'm not exactly sure when we're going to get this out. But bottom line is we are right at the end of the duck season here, and we're not calling you to talk about how many mallards are still wintering there in Manitoba and Winnipeg because it's been bitterly cold up there. We're actually calling to go ahead and start looking forward to the spring and summer and opportunities for breeding waterfowl. There's always something for waterfowl hunters to think about and look forward to. It doesn't take very long before we're looking forward to next year, and that's already kind of what we're talking about because as we discussed at length last year, everything that we see in the fall and winter really begins the subsequent spring and summer, when we start talking about wetland conditions, when we start talking about the number of birds that are going to be going back north to try to occupy, hopefully, abundant wetland conditions. Last year, and actually the year before that, last year was actually incredibly dry. The year before that was really dry in Canada, had some moisture in North Dakota. But, this is the point is that here we are, end of January, early February, and already looking forward to kind of what ducks might encounter whenever they get back north. Hopefully, it's going to be a little improvement from last year. We're going to get into that a little bit later on here, but first, I wanted to give you an opportunity to give us a recap of kind of how December played out for y'all there in Canada. And I say that because in at least the eastern portion of the U.S., December was pretty miserable from a waterfowl hunter standpoint. It was warm, unseasonably warm. I think I was running around here with short sleeves on and maybe even shorts on Christmas Day. I hunted very little in December just because I didn't want to be out there in those kind of warm, stale conditions. But what was December like for y'all?
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that, Mike. I actually made it back to Southwest Iowa to visit family, and on Christmas Day, it was 55 degrees Fahrenheit there, so it was pretty warm there. Here at home in Canada, it was cold. It was plenty cold. December, we had quite a few days where we were, lows could have been 20 below zero. That's continued through January, but we have gotten some snow. We've continued to accumulate some snow through December and January. It's not enough that I'm ready to tell you the drought will be broken when it runs off and everything will be good. We've got some snow. I know we talked about soil moisture wasn't great going into the fall. So, at freeze up, we didn't have a lot of soil moisture. So for things to really change, we'll need more snow and we'll need the right kind of conditions to happen at runoff for that water to actually translate into wetland basins and improve things.
As we've talked about a number of times, there are multiple moving parts within any aspect of waterfowl populations and waterfowl hunting. There is never just one variable that is overall controlling things. Even prairie wetland conditions fall into that category where we can look at a landscape that may have an abundance of snowfall on it in late January and early February, as you just kind of alluded to, if there's not a good frost seal from the preceding fall, and maybe if the thaw in the spring is really slow, then we don't really gain from a lot of that snow that we would have seen in January and February. So there are a lot of interacting factors here. And so I guess we kind of have one thing working against us from the prairie landscape perspective, at least in Canada. Things may be a little different in parts of the Dakotas, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But at least there in prairie Canada, not a great frost seal. Even if we do get a lot of snow, we got a good start, it sounds like, but we're going to need some more. What's the next thing that we're going to need to look for? What's the rate of thaw that we would really want to see in order to do the best at filling those wetlands?
Yeah, well, I think the perfect conditions for runoff would be if we set up where we stay cold through, kind of the end of March into early April, and then things warm up all at once. And if things start to melt all at once and all that moisture in the snow kind of moves and starts running all at once, that's the ideal conditions. If we start to warm up in February and, we lose some of the snow, that just provides more opportunity for that to kind of soak in and be, it will improve soil moisture, but not much of it will actually flow across the landscape. So, the longer we stay cold, and then if we get kind of a big warm up all at once, that's probably the best conditions that we can get, and last year did not set up like that. We didn't have much snow, and we did warm up kind of gradually, and it wasn't in late March or early April. It was in February, and then there's just opportunity for some of that snow to evaporate and not turn into water in wetlands, which is what all of us duck folks would like to see.
And then what about like the blowing snow? If we get real strong winds, is that good? Is that bad? Does that kind of concentrate some of those snow into the wetlands? And what about different types of snow? I've had some emails here lately and you and I have talked about not all snow is equal, and sometimes wind can change things.
That's right.
What other factors kind of play into what we ultimately see?
Well, in this landscape, wind definitely plays a factor, and we've had that where we've got snow, and then once the snow stops, we get strong winds, and that will really move the snow around. It will let it drift, and when that happens, lots of the snow does end up in the low spots, especially if we have vegetation like cattails and the typical emergent vegetation in the wetlands. Some of the things that happen on the landscape is some producers will burn their wetlands in the fall. That makes it harder to accumulate that snow in the wetlands. And that's why they do it, because they don't want those wet spots out there. But yeah, so we've had the wind. So we probably do have quite a bit of snow deposited in the wetlands. But yeah, like you said, snow can be different. Like the last dose that we got here, when I went out on the driveway, if you stuck a ruler into it, it probably measured a couple inches deep, but it was so light and fluffy that I could have moved all that snow off of my driveway with a leaf blower if I'd have chosen to have done it that way. It was almost no moisture in it, mostly air. That's compared to, I know we talked about the first dose of snow we got was very wet, and it started as rain and turned to snow, and so we had a slushy layer. We do have a slushy layer at the bottom of kind of the base of the snow. That's turns into much more water equivalent, or sometimes we provide maps that are snow water equivalent. That's if you melted that much snow, how much water would it turn into? So those things definitely play a role too.
And this is the time of year where we start to, within Ducks Unlimited, and actually even on social media now, I'm seeing people start to circulate some of those maps, the soil, snow, water equivalent maps showing where we are. And, if you were to compare this year to last year, we're probably in a better place this year with regard to the maps as they currently stand. But because of the things that we've already talked about here, we can't draw any conclusions on what that's going to mean for wetland conditions, other than we do know, given the extreme nature of the drought last year, we're still going to need more snow in order to declare any type of recovery from the drought. We have a long way to go. And I think that's going to be a common theme. I know it's going to be a common theme out west. I was talking with Virginia Getz just the other day, and she says the same thing. They received a lot of beneficial rain over during the winter, but they're going to need a lot more in order to improve conditions for breeding waterfowl as we start to go forward. So a lot of the drought discussion that we talked about, that we had last year, I think is going to stay with us here at least for a few more months. Hopefully we can get things turned around, but it's going to take some time. I guess one bright spot, Scott, I don't know if you have any insight on this, would be southeastern North Dakota and maybe northeastern South Dakota, if I get those directions and states correct. There is a spot up there in sort of portions of North and South Dakota where, based on some of the drought maps, they're no longer in a drought. They've had enough rain to turn things around there, at least based on what the maps are showing. You have any insight on that and how conditions may be shaping up south of the border?
Yeah, well, I guess I drove through that country when we came back from Christmas after visiting family, and there was definitely snow there. So, that will probably help out, and maybe that's what it's based on, because I'm pretty sure they probably haven't had any liquid water in a few months like we have up here.
Yeah, I think they might have got some rain there in the fall, and it's so partly that, but then also maybe some of the snow that has fallen since then. So a combination of factors, I think, are helping in a pretty small location.
Yeah, that could definitely be the case. I know, we were talking about the snowpack maps. When I look at those maps now across Prairie, Canada, the trend that I see is a pretty common one where, kind of in the northern tier of what we would call the prairie pothole region is kind of the parkland area that has more of the aspen trees scattered about. That tends to be wetter, and we see a little more snowpack in there. When you move down further south into the true prairie areas, that would just be grassland, and the aspen trees are not present there. It's still dry there. Despite the fact that we do have some snow on the ground, it's not much different than it was last year. We see a little bit better in the parklands, and yeah, one of the conversations that I'm having right now is with our staff. We're planning for, if it's dry again, what sort of drought response are we going to provide, relative to access to our properties for local ag producers to, cut hay or graze, because that forage that keeps them in business and keeps them continuing to provide waterfowl habitat in the grasslands and the wetlands is something that's in short supply. So we're having conversations about that already. What kind of conditions will trigger us to release access to some of our areas?
Scott, that's a useful transition here as we start to talk about the waterfowl themselves as they travel back north here. They'll be moving back north here pretty soon, before you know it. It's been an unusually, I don't know factually exactly where this one ranks, but it certainly feels like this has been a January here in the mid-continent where it's been colder than normal. We've had a number of cold fronts that have come through and kept the temperatures depressed for quite a length of time. It's actually been really nice if you like cold weather and if you're a duck hunter. And so it was pretty easy as a duck hunter to get excited about the cold temperatures that we were seeing. We did have a few periods where we bumped back up into the 50s. You get a southerly flow, and maybe that moves some birds around. But we were a bit light on precipitation, and still across much of this area. I think a lot of the states shared that sentiment. There were some local rain events that helped out things, but overall, the dominant theme has been that was a cold January. Any hunter that was out there probably saw fewer birds than what they might expect, kind of given that, or what they might have hoped to, let me put it like that, given that cold temperature. And I know this is something we're going to be talking about on a few subsequent episodes. And the one thing that I've told people, I experienced all that myself. All the places I hunted, I just didn't see very many birds. But if you look at all of the surveys, the midwinter surveys from the states down here, they showed big increases in duck numbers from December to January. Then that doesn't mean that there was a large number of ducks overall. It just means that there were pretty noticeable increases from December to January, and that tells me ducks moved in response to those January temperatures, but there just weren't very many around. And all of that is consistent with what you were talking about throughout last summer, through what we talked about with so many other people, that there just wasn't a lot of production. You saw it in your hunting in the fall up there. Our chief scientist, Steve Adair, saw it in his hunting. I think he said this is one of the first years where he's actually been skunked on a couple of hunts. Maybe Mike Zemansky, if I'm remembering correctly, said the same thing. So there just weren't a whole lot of ducks to begin with. But when you're a southern hunter or a duck hunter in general, and you're operating under a liberal harvest framework, you expect to see a lot of ducks. You know how that is. You've been down here, and but it was just different. And so, I mean, it seems like it's a pretty simple answer, but just kind of talk about it from the standpoint of what it means with regard to ducks coming back north. Is there any silver lining in that the ducks that do make it back are going to be extraordinarily or unusually experienced? Do we know anything about that? Just kind of talk about it from a standpoint of the birds that we think we're going to have going back north.
Yeah, well, I guess it's, this is kind of seeing the glass as half full. You're right. Most of the breeding population that will arrive back will be adult birds, because we just didn't have many young birds in the fall flight coming south at the end of the summer and early fall. So we do know from the science that adult birds have more experience and generally more successful. The counter to that is, right now, if this were early April, we'd be saying, yeah, conditions aren't great. So, they're going to come back to sort of not super favorable environmental conditions, not great wetland conditions, but that could change before we get to that April time period when mallards and pintails are showing up. But yeah, I think that's accurate to say most of the population returning will be adult birds. And in general, we know adult birds are more successful than young birds. So maybe that's the silver lining to the challenge.
Well, you have to look for silver linings if you're a duck hunter, if you're a waterfowl hunter, right? So we have to always find some good in it.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I shouldn't have let that comment pass about the chief scientist there. I spend a little time hunting with Dr. Adair, and, so him getting skunked, part of that may not be on the fall flight. Part of that could be on him. We should just offer that as a hypothesis that's definitely viable.
Well, we will have to see what he says in response to that. Scott, let's see. I'm not sure how much else we want to talk about here. There's only so many things we can say about what we currently have with regard to snowpack. We need more. We know that. We've talked a little bit about the birds, and they're still down here right now. It's still cold. This is the last week of January. It's going to be in the teens, I believe, maybe in the morning or maybe even on Saturday, actually, here in North Mississippi. So it's still cold. There's not a whole lot of ducks anyway that are starting their northward migration that I'm aware of. Still some ways to go there. But what else? Anything else we need to talk about here? We'll be connecting back with you in the fall, or I'm sorry, in the spring. But what else do we need to know?
Yeah, I think maybe the other theme that we've had all along as we talked about the drought that happened last year is, our prediction was that, there will be some birds, but as they come south, they will be rather uncooperative because they were adult birds. And it sounds like, based on your experience and at least what you heard from others, that was generally true. The survey said, yeah, there are some birds around. They just weren't very cooperative for, harvesting as many as you might have liked to.
Yeah, I've heard that in many different places from many different people. If people were listening to you, were listening to us last year as we talked about the drought and what it was going to mean for a fall flight, then I would hope that they would reflect on this hunting season and say, yeah, that's pretty consistent. Maybe they wouldn't have expected a liberal framework, but that's an entirely different conversation. And I know people are scratching their heads about some of that, but that's, that's a conversation and legitimate discussion to have as well. And we've gone through quite a bit of that on past episodes and why it is the way it is, and
Right.
what role harvest plays in overall population dynamics and so forth. And we'll continue to have those conversations. But yep, this is definitely an interesting year. Hopefully we can get the population surveys and pond surveys conducted this year. I think every waterfowl hunter should be pulling for that, and every waterfowl manager should be pulling for that. That's sort of the next big box to be checked is, can we get that survey conducted in its entirety this year? And I know you don't have any insight on that, but that's going to be our state, or actually our federal partners, probably more than anything else, that are going to be, that will be the critical decision makers there on that May BPOP.
Yeah, that's right. We do partner with the Canadian Wildlife Service folks up here. We provide some funding and contract some contract staff who basically do the ground portions of the air ground survey for them. So, we partner with them on that. That hasn't happened the past 2 years. But yeah, I can tell you, I have money in the budget to hire those people, and we're all hopeful that we get them hired and they're out there counting birds this spring.
Absolutely. Well, Scott, that's going to wrap it up here for this episode. Appreciate you helping us sort of put a bookend on season 5. We probably have a couple more episodes to go after this one releases, but reconnecting with you and hearing about a report from the prairies is always an important part of closing out our season, because like I said, we're looking forward already to what the spring and summer is going to hold and what that will mean for what we see next fall and winter. Scott, thank you for joining us, and look forward to catching up with you a little bit later on in the spring.
Okay, that sounds great, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Scott Stevens, Director of Regional Operations for the Prairies and Boreal with Ducks Unlimited Canada. We always appreciate his unique insights from Canada, especially this time of year and as we get into the spring. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the terrific job he does with these episodes, getting them out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time spending it with us here on the podcast, and we thank you for support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.